Buy my novel, Escape from the Village, from major booksellers online. Go to escapevillage.com. Subscribe to my Substack. Go to fountainheadforum.substack.com. Thank you. Welcome to the party, pal. This is Chris Baker. This is Fountainhead Forum 126. I'm talking with Robert Campbell, who is a longtime professor of psychology at Clemson, and he's been active with the Objectivist movement for a long time. And we are going to talk about the current state of the Objectivist movement, in particular the Zionism that has effectively taken over the movement, not to mention the all the schisms and other things that have happened over the years and where we think it might end up. How are you, Robert?
Okay.
When did you first get involved with or read Ayn Rand?
I read Ayn Rand when I was in high school.
When was that about?
Well, let's see. I think I read Atlas Shrugged in 1968.
Okay.
And read The Fountainhead a year later or something like that. It's been a while.
So you never got involved with the Nathaniel Branden Institute, obviously. But
when
did you first?
I didn't know about. I can't remember whether my cheap paperback of Atlas Shrugged had anything about. Well, still had a dedication to Nathaniel Branden in it because she hadn't taken that out yet. But if there was a card in there for NBI, I didn't do anything with it, and pretty soon that wouldn't have worked anyway.
Well, they've always had they've had the business reply cards, I think, for a long time, as far as I know. But they did in the 90s. I don't know what kind of business reply cards they might have had back then.
They did. They had them. I remember hearing a little while later that Nathaniel Branden was no longer in good graces with Ayn Rand, but I didn't really know any inside baseball stuff until I went to college.
Yeah. Some early editions of Atlas Shrugged do have the Nathaniel Branden dedication. Later editions do not.
Yep.
So that's
I went to college in '71. I started working for Ergo probably spring of '72, something like that. And at Ergo, which was run out of MIT, I heard all the inside stuff, including some that, especially upon later thought, was not so great.
Yeah.
By the way, the people at Ergo, even though they were pretty orthodox objectivists, had not by and large sent Nathaniel Branden to Coventry. He actually even spoke at some event of theirs later, I think.
Yeah. Ergo, as far as I know, that was a little newspaper that lasted for a long time, as far as I know, too. I mean,
yes, it did. It had been around for a while before I arrived, and it lasted for quite a few years after I stopped working there.
So, but that was you went to University of Texas for grad school. But when did you? So that was your first involvement with what you might call organized objectivism.
Oh yeah, Ergo, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Any other? Were you at MIT about the same time as Dirk Pearson and Sandy Shaw?
They had just left, as far as I know. By the way, I wasn't at MIT. I was at Harvard.
Ergo. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. You were at Harvard, but
I used to walk down Mass Ave. I used to walk down to Mass Ave to get to the campus center and work at Ergo.
I'm sorry for making that assumption. Yes, and all of those are kind of there in the same. There's Tufts, there's Harvard, there's
they had
MIT,
people from Boston University there too.
BU, yeah. There's quite a few pretty big colleges in Boston in that area. Yeah. So okay, yeah. So you were at Harvard, yeah. So what would you say about the current state or the state of the objectivist movement at the time? I mean, there wasn't really any big organization there at the time. It was just kind of a.
Well, there was this embittered remnant grouped around Rand herself.
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't quite true that she had, she said publicly that she had given up on trying to have an objectivist movement. That wasn't quite true. I mean, there were still Leonard Peikoff courses and a few others that were, that you could get. Well, you could rent them and play them for people by corresponding actually with Rand's personal secretary. It was a very small operation. I mean, I heard Peikoff courses, I was working at Ergo. They were put on at various places around Boston. But yeah, I heard that there was this guy named Harry Binswanger who had something to do with Rand's inner circle. I heard about a few other people, but its activity level was quite low. Peikoff remade his history of philosophy lectures because he had given them under NBI, and when he started giving them, I guess directly under Rand, he remade them. But I'm not, I don't know to this day how much difference there was.
And from what it seems like to me, though, it kind of went from, Nathaniel Brandon was supposed to be here intellectual there, and Aaron, then he was out, and then Barbara Brandon was out. And then Alan and Joan Mitchell Blumenthal were out. And then did it kind of go in that order, or was there anybody else? It seemed like there were a lot of people
that's
the heirs, and then
that's basically what happened. I mean, when else
went by the wayside.
When the Blumenthals broke with Rand, I, at that time was paying very little attention to whoever was still hanging around her. I only learned about that later. But the Blumenthals left, and a couple of other people who probably weren't considered potential intellectual heirs got booted out for various reasons, and only Peikoff was left. But Peikoff seemed like the guy who was going to succeed Rand, not because she was saying he was her intellectual heir. She wasn't using that expression then. In fact, she supposedly gave up on that after Brandon failed as her intellectual heir. But he was the public face of all of this, because Rand would show up once a year when she was in decent health at Fort Hall Forum. Yeah, I saw her there once, heard her over the radio from Fort Hall Forum another time. And that was that. She was not totally invisible, but not in front of the public much by the early 70s.
What was the mood of the movement back then, or what was what do you think? What do you think was different then that's not there now? I mean, was it obviously with Ayn Rand being still alive, that certainly has an impact on the movement.
Well, there was considerable apprehension among the Orthodox types about doing anything that would offend Rand personally.
Okay.
Because she was still in the loop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was a concern. I mean, Ergo actually, the editors of Ergo got chewed out at one point for putting a book by Nathaniel Brandon on a list of recommended books.
Oh, wow.
I mean, to their credit, they didn't back down. They didn't take it off the list or repudiate Brandon, but they were urged to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. So that, and because there were some
other people. I remember to this day what one of the editors said about what they'd been told and why they didn't do it. He said, well, I kept asking, what exactly did Nathaniel Brandon do? Because, we've never been told. And the final answer was, because he has hurt Ayn Rand, period.
Yeah.
And, they decided that wasn't enough of a reason to not mention anything by Nathaniel Brandon.
They always make these vague comments on this stuff like this. And often it's like, well, my feelings were hurt or something like that. It's so ridiculous. But anyway, from there, there were some other people though coming up too, though. I mean, that was, I think David Kelly was starting to get involved with the movement, and Tibor McCann, and a few other people.
Kelly was there, but I never heard of David Kelly until like the early 1980s.
Okay, yeah. There was but that was where we were kind of getting.
And Tibor didn't last very long with whether it was NBI or after NBI. I think that may have been during NBI, but I honestly don't know.
Tibor was always kind of his own man, and most of the people, I should point out, a lot of the people we're talking about are no longer with us. David Kelly, of course, is still alive, and as far as I know, Alan and Joan Mitchell Blumenthal are still alive too. I haven't heard anything about them, and Leonard Peikoff, of course, is still alive, and he still owns all the copyrights and all that stuff.
Well, yes, he is still alive, and he's going to be 90 in about 6 weeks. And from some stuff I was catching up on before this podcast, I saw what ARI Watch had to say about the current status of the copyrights, because at different points in the last 3 years, they've been all are going to go to ARI.
Yes.
All are going to go to OSI, Craig Biddle's outfit.
Yeah.
The latest as of last year is that the copyrights to the novels will go to Kira Peikoff. All other copyrights will go to ARI. But obviously, a bunch of people who still have some personal connection with Peikoff are leaning on him to do one thing or another, and it's hard to know how good his decision making is anymore. I mean, he could easily, when he dies, his will could specify something different from what we've heard so far. The guy keeps changing his mind.
This could go to court too, but I don't. Yeah.
It could go to court. Well, one of the things I learned is that OSI claimed that it now held the trademark on Ayn Rand's name, which is unenforceable, but that's something that ARI had for years.
Trademark on the name. That's interesting.
Trademark on the name. Well, when Chris Schiabera started the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies, they threatened to sue him.
Of course.
And he got a lawyer who had actually been affiliated with the Rand movement years back.
Holzer?
Guy named Murray Frank, I think it was.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Yeah, okay, you've heard of him. And Murray Frank said, they're not going to be able to get away with this. You can't just trademark somebody's name. They basically the lawyer for the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies told them to take a hike, and they did not go to court.
That's good. Yeah. Robert.
But they still pretend anyway that they have a trademark on her name.
One thing that I have heard, is that Nathaniel Branden was kicked out of official objectivism in 1968, and then he showed up at the seminar in 1996 that was at the University of Colorado at the Institute for Objectivist Studies, which is now the Atlas Society. But Nathaniel Branden said something to you that I thought was very telling.
Yeah. Okay. It was his remark about how the demographics of people attending objectivist events had changed, and he was wondering where all the women were, because for quite some time, not just at what was then called the Institute of Objectivist Studies, 1996, in the 80s, even toward the end of Ayn Rand's life, objectivist groups were majority male. Any that I encountered.
I don't know.
That had not been the case at NBI, apparently.
Yeah,
he noticed
it. Yeah. I wondered if he noticed that, and obviously we're just going on hearsay and observations, but all we really can do is talk to people who were there, because I don't think there was anybody officially taking down attendance figures, but there certainly were a lot of a lot of women who were involved with that movement, though, too, that were in high positions, and it was probably about half and half, maybe even more women than men in the high positions with Ayn Rand. And of course, because the novelist is a woman, I don't know if that made a difference or not. But
yes, I think it probably did. If you think about a woman who's not willing to, who's got her doubts about living a conventionally approvable life in the United States, say in the 1950s, there were some other ways to go besides developing an interest in Rand, but those might not have been attractive. I mean, Betty Friedan, before she published The Feminine Mystique, was a communist.
Yes,
you wouldn't know that from reading that book. I didn't know it from reading that book. I learned that about her many years later. But there weren't. Go back to something Jerome Tuchile said years ago during the Eisenhower administration. They're developing an interest in Rand was one way of rejecting the conventional culture of that time. And, there were other ways. You could become a beatnik, let's say, or whatever, but those, didn't appeal to everybody.
Yeah, Robert, one thing, too, that might be telling is everybody who was in Ayn Rand's original circle, or at least most of them, came to her via the Fountainhead because Atlas Shrugged hadn't been published yet. And now it seems like more people show up at Objectivist events that really did start with Atlas Shrugged. And I've definitely noticed that. There's definitely a difference in personality between those two.
Well, that will make a difference. Atlas Shrugged is a very different sort of novel from the Fountainhead in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And I don't, we've got confounding factors, namely that Ayn Rand herself is now long gone. And even before she died, she was less and less of a public figure, really, as time went on.
The Fountainhead was published in 1943. The Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957. So,
right.
Rand started to get this circle in the 50s. So
her initial inner circle, besides sometimes being called the collective, was called the Class of 43.
Yeah, the Class of 43. Yes, that's another term. Robert, what do you think? Was there as much hostility toward libertarians in the 70s as there is now? I mean, it seems like that's been a gap that's really been widening.
Yes, there was. Now, Ergo, for instance, there's no way Ergo would have endorsed John Hospers for president because Ayn Rand had said negative things about him in particular and libertarians in general. But I'm sure some of the people on the Ergo staff wrote in his name in 1972. Okay. In fact, I'd be very surprised if some of them didn't. There were libertarian organizations, not the Libertarian Party, but there were some others that were active at the time that didn't last. But for a while, I was working at Ergo and also in one of these organizations. It was called Individuals for a Rational Society for a hot minute. Yeah. Remember that anybody in the Boston area, even though a couple of people at Ergo actually knew people who hung around with Rand, like Binswanger, and occasionally, talked to them on the phone or something. What was left of Rand's circle was in New York City. Wasn't in Boston. Wasn't anywhere else.
Yeah.
Its geographical reach was limited.
Yeah.
When Nathaniel Branden got booted out of the movement, he moved to Los Angeles and discovered that all of the people who had been NBI objectivists out there pretty much were okay with him. He just kept working with them or doing business with them.
Yeah, it seemed like it was a different culture out there. I think they probably did have a big, because of course, the Ayn Rand Institute is still located in Southern California, and that's where some other organizations got started. Also, that was where Bob LaFave was out too. Although he wasn't an objectivist, that was another freedom school.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I don't really know exactly how ARI ended up being in Southern California. Other than the fact that once it became clear that Leonard Peikoff could not get a permanent position as a philosophy professor in the New York area, there was nothing holding him there, and maybe an active desire to get the hell out of there. I can't speak to the latter, but it seems likely.
Well, there was also a time, when New York was considered high crime and all that stuff, and LA had a little more.
Well, New York in the 70s was in bad shape. There were headlines about, I think it was President Ford supposedly saying, he hadn't said this in as many words, to New York City, which was in a financial crisis, drop dead,
Yeah. So we're getting a little, Robert, one thing that I think the movement did have back then, though, is there was still the Soviet Union around, and obviously Rand despised the Soviet Union, and she would always, talk about, the bloody slaughterhouse of altruism that is Soviet Russia, like she would say. She would always call it Soviet Russia, and that really served as kind of the top villain for the objectivist movement, at least. Yeah.
Well, it did.
Immanuel Kant, but that was something that was real and was actually a present.
Okay. Danger. Well, there are a couple of layers to that. One is that Rand's attitude toward the Soviet Union toward the contemporary Soviet Union became far more negative after her sister visited and decided to go back at the end of the visit after having not gotten along well with her while she was in New York. There came to be this sort of bloody mindedness about the Soviet Union that you didn't find in a lot of Rand's earlier writings about it, even though she was always extremely critical of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
You go back and you look at the stuff she said at Ford Hall Forum in the 70s. When I was researching the way that ARI had or Peikoff himself actually had Rand's question and answer periods rewritten to suit him. I was reminded of how many things she had said about the Soviet Union, including statements to the effect that basically everyone who remained in the Soviet Union, did not die trying to overthrow the government, did not did not defect, flee the country, basically deserved to die in a nuclear war.
Wow, yeah.
She did not talk that way about the Soviet Union in the 50s. She talked about it that way in the 70s.
That's very interesting, Robert. This is a very interesting story. Ayn Rand, left in 1926, and then apparently, and many of her much of her family died in the siege of Leningrad at the time. But her sister managed to survive, and later saw a picture of her and found, oh my goodness, that's my sister, and contacted her and actually came to America to visit. This was Ayn Rand's sister.
Right.
And I remember the one story she said she went out to the store and was overwhelmed by all these different brands of toothpaste. It's like, I didn't know which toothpaste to buy. It's like, it was kind of
people who were allowed to visit the United States from the Soviet Union, or people who defected and, had not really been around in the U.S. before, often had experiences like that. Usually they adapted to them. They didn't feel like, I can't tolerate this. I'd rather wait in line outside of gum or something.
Yeah.
But
it just becomes what you're used to, unfortunately. Yeah. And by then, of course, you live. But it's very interesting though that she apparently got a little more angry and maybe a little more jingoistic at the time. Robert, the one thing we're talking about though now is, even though Ayn Rand, has been dead for over 40 years now, is the current objectivist movement obsession with, pedestalizing Israel and villainizing really the entire Muslim world.
Okay.
Say that this is maybe now being applied to the Muslim world the same way that Rand had this attitude toward the Soviet Union.
I mean, I can say a little bit about that.
Yeah.
I look. I mean, there are roots for these kinds of attitudes in Rand's own speeches and writings, especially in the last 15 years of her life. She really didn't. If you look at what was in the Objectivist newsletter and the Objectivist before the 1967 war, Rand wasn't very interested in Israel. And the frequency and the intensity of her comments about Israel and her comments against Arabs ramped up during the 1970s. So by the time she died, she was pretty much fanatically pro-Israel. And whatever her personal views about Israel were in, say, 1960, she may have had a quite positive view of Israel in 1960, but that wasn't something she thought was important. She didn't write about it.
Yeah. I mean, early objectivism was a lot of cases just about living a better life. And I think, really you could kind of see Brandon's influence, because Nathaniel Brandon Nathaniel Brandon was always just writing psychology and self-help books. And maybe that was more of the influence. And once Brandon was gone, it went more over into this. But Rand also really, there really wasn't that much on foreign policy, period, from her. It was almost, and if anything, it was about foreign policy. She was often critical of the fact that the U.S. had been in World War II at all.
Well, she had a complicated view of the war in Vietnam, we can say, but she basically thought that the United States had been suckered into fighting in Vietnam. It would be interesting to know what she actually thought about the Korean War, because I don't know of any writings of hers that address that. And the Korean War was pretty much a predictor of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and even of the way that such a war was likely to turn out. Because the model going into when, LBJ started sending all these troops to Vietnam, the model was, well, we don't want to get too close to, we don't want to invade North Vietnam in force and, get close to the border with China, because if we do that, it's going to be like what happened in Korea when foreign troops got too close to the Yalu River.
Yeah, and I mean, and strictly speaking, the Korean War has never ended. I mean, there was a ceasefire, and we've just been in this it's been in a ceasefire for 70 years now. Well, but the troops are still there, and they're still ready and watching with their guns. The war.
A lot of that has to do with the attitudes of the Kim dynasty that rules North Korea, because they don't want permanent peace with the United States.
Yeah.
In fact, North Korean propaganda basically says that North Korea is not obliged to keep any commitments it makes to a country like the United States anyway.
Yeah. Well, so it is. I do remember also once she did write positively, that the U.S. should at least try to stand by Taiwan, which I definitely think that the good guy, bad guy situation is a lot more clear in the situation with Taiwan versus communist China. But and I would say we certainly have a much more clear good guy and bad guy in the case of North and South Korea. But
it's interesting about Taiwan because she commented about it a tiny bit. A couple of the people at Ergo were really big on the whole idea that the United States mishandled, China after World War II, and that bad people in the State Department, et cetera, basically lost China, quote unquote.
Yeah.
From what I've learned subsequently about the Civil War post 1945 in China, I'm not sure that the United States could have done much to save the Kuomintang regime in most of China.
Yeah.
There were too many things wrong with it, and it was bleeding popular support. A bunch of, quite often, a bunch of Kuomintang troops would just defect to the Maoist side after a battle.
Yeah. I
You know,
didn't want to go into.
You're not going to be able to keep. You're not going to be able to keep control of the situation if that's.
I didn't necessarily want to go into the detail, into all the deep details of all these wars.
Well, you just reminded me that some of the people at Ergo were kind of obsessed with what the United States had done in China after World War II. I don't recall Rand ever being particularly obsessed with that.
Yeah, well, Rand would certainly criticize, the fact that so much of Europe had been surrendered to the Soviet Union, which she definitely was not in favor of.
Yeah.
And she talked about the famines, and as she also wrote, said under the inept government of the czars, Russia was a major grain exporter, and now they're begging for grain. Which she thought was one of the most damning indictments you could make against collectivism. But Robert, there does seem to be a little more. I think especially when you're talking about war, it's like a friend of mine says, when in doubt, zoom out. Wars are rarely isolated incidents. And, but there seemed to be a more sense of, we can't just look at, the 6-Day War. We have to go back and look at other things. And really, what's happening in Israel right now really is, now just another battle in a war that's really been going on for over 90 years. And yet ARI always acts like ARI, to this day and age, they always act like there's no past anymore. That this all just started, this all just started 3 weeks ago.
I haven't been following what anybody at ARI says about war in the Middle East for quite a while. And part of the reason I lost interest in even trying to follow it is because there are people affiliated with ARI in the past who have, there's a guy named Ron Pizzaturo, for instance, who called openly for the United States to basically nuke most of the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, whatever. Just turn the surface of the ground there into glass. Okay. Craig Biddle, speaking of OSI, was calling for the carpet nuking of Iran. And he's not the only person who formerly affiliated or currently affiliated with ARI to say stuff like that.
Yeah, it definitely went off. It definitely seems to have gotten kind of to a point of madness. I don't know where.
By the way, speaking of Islam, Rand scarcely made a comment that has come down to us on the record about Islam. There's an implied slam at it in the introduction to Objectivist epistemology, where she talks about bad definitions of man or of human being. And she says, for instance, a definition as a Mohammedan animal, that's clearly a poke there. But she more often referred to Arabs as uncivilized and primitive than as motivated by Islam as a religion, even though I'm sure she didn't like Islam.
And what's troubling is that, said, no, maybe they have a civilization. They just have a kind of civilization that you might not understand. I mean, I'm not sympathetic to the Islamic world either, but and certainly are some horrible human rights violations in those countries. But the one thing that I definitely get the impression is that up until the end of World War II, the Arab world and the Islamic world generally had a positive opinion of the USA.
I would say they had a neutral to somewhat positive opinion, depending on where and the circumstances. Look, the United States prior to World War II had not tried to seize control of some portion of the Arab world or some portion of, say, the Persian world. It wasn't like Britain or Russia, Britain and Russia a couple of times basically tried to partition Iran into about 50% for Russia and 50% for Britain.
Yeah.
They were not able to make such arrangements last, but it wasn't for lack of trying.
Yeah, there were definitely attempts there.
Britain controlled Egypt for a while, and so on and so on. The United States had no history of doing that kind of stuff prior to World War II. So that's a very significant difference there.
Yeah, I mean, I think of two events. I think the U.S.'s support for Israel, and then also, the overthrowing of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. Those are two huge events that really
well,
public opinion away.
I mean, I still have on my stack a history of Iran that I've read part of, but I haven't gotten to the rise and fall of Mossadegh yet. Even though the Brits and the Americans were involved in getting rid of him, the movement to overthrow him also had the support of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was not known outside that country yet, but was, somewhat of a player inside the country already. So that's complicated. Even today, however, when Iran declares the United States to be the great Satan or the greater Satan, they still include Britain as a lesser Satan. It's not just
Well, I've had some people say that Britain still really does control our foreign policy, but Robert, but it really is kind of interesting.
World, I don't think
because
that's,
but I do think
I would say there's some commonality of interest between American intelligence services and British intelligence services, but that's not because Britain controls this country in any real way.
Well, there's another thing too that I've heard also is that when Israel was founded, they were undecided on what they tried to play both sides of the Cold War. They didn't really take a side either way until really after the 6-Day War, when apparently the Russians intervened on the side of the Arabic nations. And so Israel said, okay, we've got to ally ourselves with the U.S. and Western Europe.
Well, Stalin's reaction to the formation of Israel was quite strange. The Soviet Union was one of the first countries to recognize Israel diplomatically. But as soon as Israel was up and running, in Stalin's mind, any Jewish person in the Soviet Union now owed primary allegiance to a foreign country, namely Israel. And so Stalin started persecuting Jews in a manner that he hadn't. I mean, he had Jewish people killed before, he had them purged before, but he started getting systematic in his attacks on Jews. And if he hadn't died in early 1953, I mean, he was getting ready to have a bunch more Jewish people killed. Jewish doctors were supposedly poisoning him and all that. Yes. So that's a little weird, but Israel tried to stay. Israel tried to avoid antagonizing the Soviet Union for a while. I don't know the full diplomatic history on that because the Soviets were sponsoring Nasser in Egypt after a while. Yeah, and they were doing that before '67.
Yeah, and Israel, and of course Egypt for a long time was Israel's greatest enemy until basically they got bribed by the U.S. to be nice to them.
What I would say, circling back to Rand herself, is that any attitude that you find in ARI or other such organizations that's heavily pro-Israel, the only basis for that in Rand is from really the 1970s. Because before that, Israel was just not something that she thought was needed comment from her. Whatever her private feelings about it.
I do wonder Robert, certainly you'll hear among many objectivists to claim to be admirers of Thomas Jefferson, but I really do wonder how many of them have actually read Thomas Jefferson. I read Thomas Jefferson before I read Ayn Rand, and there were a few quotes in there from him one thing they do like to point to the fact that Jefferson went to war against the Barbary States as president, which was a case where American ships were being attacked by a foreign country. And so Jefferson went to war and got the Treaty of Tripoli. But there's also, the Jefferson, but, in many cases, the founding fathers really, to be honest, they looked down on Europe. They saw Europe as just being beneath America, and this was why they left. They left because they didn't want to get involved in all this drama,
Well, look, to somebody like Jefferson, who tried to keep the United States neutral when Britain and France were fighting, he was not really successful at that, but he tried. Yeah. The whole war between Napoleonic France and Great Britain, Austria, Hungary, whatever, was a classic example of, that Americans should not be following, of course.
Yeah.
So I get all of that. But to get back to what we were talking about before, you can make a critique of the Islamic religion along, broadly Randian lines. Some people have done that. Some people actually know something about it. But Rand had no particular interest in that subject at all. Other than that poke in Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, I don't know of any direct criticism of Islam in anything that Rand ever said in front of the public. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, Rand didn't really comment. She didn't really comment. Objectivists were never crusading atheists, but it's here's that letter from Jefferson that he wrote in 1823. I have ever deemed it fundamental for the U.S. never to take part in the active part in the quarrels of Europe. Their political interests are entirely distinct from ours. Their mutual jealousies, their balance of power, their complicated alliances, their forms and principles of government are all foreign to us. They are nations of eternal war. All their energies are expended in the destruction of the labor, property, and lives of their people. And I said, and I read it. He says that about Europe, but I'm just saying, nations of eternal war. I think this also applies to the Middle East, does it not? Nations of eternal war.
Well, it does, but there is a distinction in Islam between the Dar al-Salam and the Dar al-Harb, and if a country or a region is not under Islamic rule, which doesn't necessarily mean theocratic rule, but it means Islam is the established religion. If it's not under Islamic rule, well, it's automatically part of the Dar al-Harb. So, a lot of the world from, if you stress that particular Islamic theme, and it is a real theme in Islam, it's not the one that most concerns a lot of Islamic believers, I guess. But if you stress it, then, most of the world is the Dar al-Harb, and an able-bodied adult male Muslim has a duty to make or support jihad fi sabilillah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is definitely something. Although
that's all real. That's all in the. Stuff is in the scripture and in other writings that a lot of Muslim believers treat as though they were scripture.
Yeah, of course. How many active jihads were happening in the 1800s? I don't really know, but it seems like a lot of it. I don't think we can deny that some of these people have gotten more extreme since the founding of Israel.
Well,
obviously they have free will, but still,
you mean have say Palestinians or
Jordanians
gotten more interested in jihad since
Yes,
Israel
I think so, definitely. Yeah,
actually, since the civil unrest that was happening in Palestine in the 1920s and 30s.
It's definitely
probably more of them have gotten interested in jihad, but that's that's always available.
Yeah.
If you're a Muslim believer, you know, that's something you can make an issue out of.
Certainly. Yeah.
And,
So, you know, so
people have done it.
You know, I first read Ayn Rand in 1992, and I don't remember it really being this Zionist back in the 90s, though. And I was certainly active on the various discussion groups, as you were too. You know, the MDOP, the Objectivism mailing list, Curaz's Objectivism L. I mean, those were some. Email groups were kind of where it was, and I could say negative things about Israel, and nobody, and people would just kind of say, okay, yeah, but.
The kind of people who were active in Dave Kelly's organization in the 90s, because I actually encountered some of them back then. You know, I remember, you know, a handful of Israeli expatriates who were involved in that, but you know, that was not where they got their membership. It was certainly not where they got their leadership. And so there wasn't a lot of stress being placed on Israel in particular. Whereas by the 1990s, you know, I don't know exactly when Yaron Brook joined ARI, but you know, the movement in that direction was already happening in ARI. I don't know all the specifics of it. You know, there's only so much about the inside baseball of ARI that I think most people can stand to learn, even if they're strongly motivated to do it. It is so personal and so petty, a lot of it. But you know, that movement in that direction was already happening there. Not so much in some other, you know, not so much on some other lists or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Well, he was the executive director from 2000 to 2017.
Yeah,
I believe Michael Berliner was before that. So,
but
Peikoff was kind of, you know, taking a step back. He wasn't really as hands-on as he had been before.
Well,
but he probably was.
I believe it was in 1998. I only learned about this years after the fact that Peikoff, you know, when he had his radio show, you know, actually admitted that he did not think of himself as a philosopher, and he had written Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, because he owed that to Ayn Rand. But, you know, really, he wasn't a philosopher by temperament, and he preferred to do other stuff and would rather people not think of him as a philosopher. You know, that's always gotten limited circulation among the ARI types because Peikoff was supposed to be the ultimate authority on objectivism. And if he felt that he was never really a philosopher and that was a somewhat mistaken career choice, well, now what?
I don't know what to say about that.
Well, they've got somebody who has been anointed as the expert on objectivism. His name is Onkar Ghate. But there's nothing about Onkar Ghate that would distinguish him from a bunch of other people at ARI. You know, in other words, does he have unusual philosophical acumen or insight? Does he even know? Does he even know the literature of objectivism better than some of the others? I don't think so.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that, but it seems like to me, ever since the after the World Trade Center, it definitely got crazier. Just with the whole, obviously there was an emotional reaction to those events.
Well, sure there was. I mean, there were some internal fallings out when. An imam in New York City who was actually mostly a con man, his project didn't go anywhere, wanted to build this skyscraper across the street from where the World Trade Center had been and put a mosque on one of the floors. Okay. And a lot of New Yorkers were very upset at that prospect. And, Peikoff, not to be outdone in his indignation, supposedly declared that if such a mosque, building with a mosque inside it were built, it should be bombed into rubble.
Yeah, I don't know. It even got to a point, where Bill O'Reilly was coming off as being more. There was one interview where he was actually being more sane than Peikoff was.
Yeah.
Well,
around that time was also when you got some of the statements. Not Pisatoros is older, but around that time you got some of the statements about let's carpet nuke Iran and so forth. Drop nukes on Iran until every square mile has been destroyed.
So what do you, but obviously, I spend more time with libertarians than I do with objectivists, but I do wish the libertarian movement would go back much more to its Randist roots. But it seems like to me objectivism is attracting different people now, and I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing. If I'd seen if I'd read Ayn Rand now, I don't know if I ever would have bothered reading Ayn Rand because of all this. And I do wonder if it's really hurting the movement, and I'm afraid it is.
Well, it's a little hard to know what to expect. I don't think the idea of an objectivist movement, this is something we've talked about before.
Yeah.
I don't think that was ever a good idea. I think when Rand, Rand probably made her declaration that she didn't want to be the leader of a movement because she was so upset at the end of NBI. But I think while NBI was running and Rand was not aware that Nathaniel Branden was, stepping out on her, she was fine with being perceived as a leader of a movement, especially when some other people did a lot of the work, for it. But in the 70s, she had this shrunken remnant of a movement while proclaiming that she didn't want to be involved with one at all. We know that given her stated intentions in the 70s, the idea of establishing an Ayn Rand Institute was not anything she had in mind. And I think establishing an Ayn Rand Institute was, in fact, a very bad idea. It was mainly to give Leonard Peikoff something to control, especially since he had pretty much tapped out his possibilities, at becoming a tenured faculty member somewhere.
I've heard that seems to be what happens is somebody gets denied tenure and they decide to go start an organization somewhere, right? Well, of course we've had different big funders come and go. Ed Snyder was who was the owner of the Philadelphia Flyers, was funding ARI for a while, and then he went over and started funding David Kelly.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I've always found that kind of ironic that the owner of the Philadelphia Flyers was funding objectivism, only because the Flyers had developed this reputation of being they called them the Broad Street Bullies, just being being very violent in hockey. They really did have. The Broad Street Bullies is what they called them in the 70s.
We're talking about Ed Snyder, but look at who some of the more recent financial benefactors of organized objectivism, particularly of ARI and OSI, have been.
Yeah, I know, Robert. But the one thing I got to ask, since we're almost getting to an end, is how do you think we can save the movement? I think one thing that has to I think
there's no function to be served by saving an objectivist movement. It was never a good idea. It didn't work. Look, ARI is a failure at an as an organization, except in maybe two respects. It raised enough money to put a significant chunk of that money in the pockets of some of its senior officers for quite a few years. Yaron Brook got paid really well to run that organization.
Yeah, well,
even people who had far less responsibility than Yaron Brook got, good money.
I guess.
And the other thing they did was to control and restrict access to the Ayn Rand archives.
I guess
a place I'm not allowed into, along with a bunch of other people who know, in some cases, much more about Rand and her ideas than the people who run the damn place.
Robert, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't want to see Ayn Rand become irrelevant, but I'm afraid that's going to happen because of these people.
Well,
unfortunately,
they've helped to make her irrelevant because if you associate Rand's writings with an organization like ARI and with the kind of people who've been running it,
I mean,
your impression of Rand, in most cases, there's a very small minority of people who are going to be more attracted to Rand's ideas because they see, say, the Ayn Rand Institute as some kind of current day embodiment or representation of them. Most people are going to run the other way.
But I mean, I don't see much. I don't really see any impact on the culture. I mean, she wrote all these warnings. I mean, Karl. We can't deny that Karl Marx is still very relevant in our world, Robert. And to me, that's a tragedy. I don't know. Maybe she's just, I mean, and with the exception of really, in a way, Nathaniel Branden did some significant things, and to his credit, Jimmy Wales, who we both knew from those seminars, has done some things. But and Larry Sanger also being the two men who created Wikipedia, who got together because of objectivism. But outside of that, we really don't. I mean, some of these other people have just been completely irrelevant, although they claim Ayn Rand is Mark Cuban has not done anything to put forth Ayn Rand's ideas, even though he claims to be a fan. And then you have some of these people like Paul Ryan and Greenspan. My God, I mean,
well, look,
Alan Greenspan is absolutely horrible. I mean,
well, I'd have to agree with your assessment of Greenspan, but Greenspan was, a fairly close associate of Rand's for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, he was never quite what Nathaniel Branden was or whatever, but he was, he was pretty significant. And there was no way, while Rand was still alive, that she was going to criticize anything Greenspan did.
Yeah.
Because of that. But, if Mark Cuban says he was inspired by Ayn Rand and he doesn't say or do anything that seems to indicate that, well, that's just him claiming that he was inspired by Ayn Rand. Lots of people do that, and some of them don't mean much by it.
Yeah.
As far as Rand's ideas having influence on the broader culture, I think there's been much more of that than maybe you're thinking about right now. But the way that Rand's ideas have acquired any purchase in the broader culture is not via, maybe in the days of NBI, you could say that NBI was helping that to happen. I think it was for a while. But it's not because of ARI. It's not because of David Kelly's organization. It's not because of Jennifer Grossman's successor to it. It's not because of Craig Biddle, who's still relying on Carl Barney as a benefactor. Okay, it's none of those people. Yeah. They have done virtually nothing. What's been a lot more significant is stuff like the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies. The Journal of Ayn Rand Studies closed down because Chris Schiabera made an arguably good point that now it was possible for people to publish about Ayn Rand in journals that didn't specialize in Ayn Rand, and therefore the need for such a thing was no longer pressing. It had been that way in 1999. It wasn't now.
Well, and if Ayn Rand can actually make roads in academia, that's fantastic, Robert, although I'm very skeptical because academia has gotten worse, a lot worse.
The general trend of academia in the United States now is just down the toilet. We're seeing massive destruction of fields that are, in some cases, far removed in terms of subject matter from any of the people or any of the areas of study that gave rise to critical race theory, intersectionality, any of that stuff.
Yeah.
But that's a topic for another time. I think we should probably close it up here.
Yeah, well, it seems like we have a case where people are rationalizing their emotions with Ayn Rand's writing, and therefore they're trying to say, okay, this is what Ayn Rand believes. I mean, I certainly can. And
Zionism's a very minor theme in Rand's.
Yeah, I know. Yes, but this initial discussion was about, it's become the major theme. I mean, Ayn Rand Center UK every day has had something about the war. They haven't talked about anything else.
Well,
I mean, it's just become center stage for them, and that's getting kind of ridiculous. It's kind
of if you're disgusted with Hamas, and what Hamas has been doing, you can join, a long line of people who have no association with Ayn Rand or anybody in that part of the intellectual universe at all. So
I mean, there's
nothing special about that.
There are always little skirmishes going on in Africa, and nobody ever comments on those. That I haven't heard them say anything about Armenia and Azerbaijan and what's happening there. But for some reason, there's an obsession with Israel, and Israel is somehow this special case that they have to put all their attention on, and it makes and Israel's certainly not a model objectivist state by any means. I know. Yeah, I knew a person years ago, and he was very much on the left, and he seemed rather puzzled with this Ayn Rand Institute obsession with Israel, and he just said, "They know it's socialist, don't they?" It's so, and even Iran had an event where he was acknowledging that Israel was becoming bad on gun rights and not as good as it used to be. So
Well, Israel apparently is really bad on gun rights, judging from the number of people who were living in fairly close proximity to the Gazan border and were not allowed to have guns.
And it seems like more and more objectivism has drifted from this, where it was about upholding the good and upholding a life of virtue, to just punishing the alleged bad guys of the week. And in this case, maybe bad guys who deserve to be designated as bad guys, but that's not.
Well,
that often ends up corrupting you.
One of the reasons why objectivism was one of several reasons why objectivism was not a good thing to have a movement about is that the objectivist philosophy did not fulfill Ayn Rand's own ambitions for it. Okay. And what I mean by that is that Rand came to the conclusion, probably while she was finishing Atlas Shrugged, probably while she was working on Atlas Shrugged, that objectivism had to be primarily about epistemology.
Yeah.
But epistemology is a very difficult subject. And by her own admission, Rand didn't cover all the bases in it.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
And if you're putting your marbles on an epistemological project, a project that has big gaps in it and has weird stuff of somewhat unclear origin, like the doctrine of the arbitrary assertion. One of the things I saw that was very interesting on ARI Watch, and this is where I'll conclude, was Yaron Brook and Greg Salmieri in 2020, not long after the presidential election in this country, in which they effectively assert, Salmieri in particular, asserted that virtually anything that anybody was saying to the effect that irregularities occurred during the election or that there was fraud was an arbitrary assertion. And you get a hold of the doctrine of the arbitrary assertion, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. And Salmieri was just running with it. Now, do most of the rank and file, even at what's left of ARI, care about the doctrine of the arbitrary assertion? I presume they don't. But this is an example of taking something in the objectivist corpus that was particularly poorly thought out and trying to make something really big out of it. Peikoff did it in his lectures until, he decided he wasn't a philosopher anymore. And subsequently, his students, his followers have taken that up, and it's useless.
Yeah, well, that's
we can pick up again another time about issues like that. But the fact that the philosophy was incomplete when Rand died, and if you believe the official line taken by ARI, not a jot or a tittle can be altered. Now, well, okay, it's
but
it's a museum piece. It's a museum piece. It's an incomplete system. It never acquired some of the components it was supposed to.
I was more interested in the intellectual issues, not the money. I mean, we could also talk about the fact that ARI completely doesn't talk about any things. But anyway, you got to go. So I'm Chris Baker. Please buy my novel, Escape from the Village. Check out my Substack. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you, Robert Campbell. We're out.
Okay.